So I apologize in advance for the noise going on in the background. My dishwasher is kind of breaking and making a lot of noise. So hopefully you can hear everything that I say. I'll try to speak up. In this screencast, we're going to talk about genetics. This is just a brief introduction. So to start, let's just define what genetics is. Genetics is the science that studies how genes are transmitted from one generation to the next. So let's begin by just reviewing a few things about genes and chromosomes. Now, the points I make here may seem a little bit random, but I think that if I remind you of these concepts before we begin this unit, it will give you a good working vocabulary that you can use and we can expand upon as we continue on this unit. So these are pretty basic concepts that you should already know, but you may need a quick refresher. So here they are. First off, remember that chromosomes are contained in the nucleus of the cell. Also, this is pretty basic. Remember that chromosomes are made of DNA. You'll also want to remember the difference between a gene and a chromosome. So a gene will be a segment of DNA that controls a hereditary trait. We'll get more on what hereditary means in just a bit. Versus chromosome will be a long chain of genes. You should also be familiar with the term trait, which is the characteristics that an organism has, like eye color or hair color, if they're tall or short, their skin color. And last but not least, we are going to be talking about something called alleles. And 2 alleles must be present in order for a trait to show up in the offspring or the baby. One must come from mom and the other from dad. When fertilization occurs, the new offspring will then have 2 alleles for every trait. Next, we're going to move on to talk about a particular man who's famous for his work in genetics. So here are some general pieces of information. This person here, Mendel, his full name is Gregor Mendel, and he was an Austrian monk that was born in 1822. He was known as the father of genetics, and there were 3 laws of genetics that he discovered that really changed biology as a whole. I'll have you do a little bit of reading later on this week, which will describe how he conducted a series of experiments in a really quiet, cool monastery garden. But Mendel spent about 14 years growing and experimenting with pea plants in this garden. Now, to get back to the laws of genetics that I mentioned previously, let's write down what those are. There are 3 basic laws of inheritance, and we still use them today. Here they are. The first law that he came up with was a law of dominance and recessiveness. Second, he made this principle of segregation. And third, he made a principle of independent assortment. We will get back to these later on. But back to some general information about Mendel. His great contribution was to demonstrate that inherited characteristics are in fact carried by genes. Gregor Mendel used a garden pea for his experiments, and this was a good choice for a couple of reasons. 1, they were readily available at the time. 2, they were easy to grow. 3, they grew really fast. And 4, the sexual structures that we find on flowers, they're completely enclosed within the petals, so there can't be any accidental cross-pollination between plants. Let's review what you need to know about sexual reproduction in flowers. As we discussed in class, there are 5 things I'm going to point out here. The first is that, as we mentioned in class, flowers contain both male and female reproductive structures. Second thing is that the female part of the flower, also known as the pistil, it is responsible for producing egg cells. The male part of the flower, the stamen, is responsible for producing the pollen, which contains sperm cells. So when the pollen content is really high outside, just think you're breathing in a whole bunch of flower sperm cells. Awesome. The fourth thing that you need to know about sexual reproduction in flowers is that when the pollen is delivered to the pistil, the female structure, the sperm will travel to the egg cell, and then the result is fertilization. Last but not least, do keep in mind that fertilization will produce a tiny embryo, and that embryo will be enclosed inside of a seed. Okay, so we know that Mendel used these pea plants, but he was using them to study genetics and do a bunch of experiments. So, some things to keep in mind. Pea flowers, they tend to be self-pollinating. So, since the male and the female reproductive structures are relatively enclosed inside of the flower, the sperm of the flower will fertilize the egg of the same flower. The resulting embryo will have the same characteristics as the parent plant. Even though sexual reproduction has occurred, there's only one parent, so different than other types of sexual reproduction that we've mentioned, where it requires separate male and females. Third, Mendel knew that these pea plants were what we call true breeding. So this means that if they are allowed to self-pollinate, they would produce offspring that are identical to themselves. For example, if they were allowed to self-pollinate, right, a tall plant would always produce tall plants. Or a plant that always has yellow seeds will always produce offspring that also have yellow seeds. It's these true breeding plants that were the cornerstone of all of Mendel's experiments. So continuing on talking about Mendel's work, Mendel wanted to produce seeds by joining the egg and the sperm from two different plants. To do this, he had to first prevent the possibility of self-pollination. So there's a lot of detail here, but basically what he did was he cut away the stamens, which are the male reproductive parts of the flower. Then he dusted the remaining female structures with pollen from a completely different plant. So we call this cross-pollination. And it produces offspring from two different parents. Then Mendel could easily do something called a crossbreeding. So he could crossbreed plants and then experiment with different characteristics. Moving on to sort of the third point that I want to make. When we're talking about Mendel's experiments, there are a couple of terms that you need to know. When I talk about something called the P generation, the P stands for parental, so parental generation. After that, we get something called an F1 generation. That's the first generation of offspring. We can continue on and have F2, F3, etc., and those all are going to be successive generations of offspring. And last but not least, you should know the word hybrid. Hybrids are going to be the offspring of parents with different traits. Okay, we'll stop there and in class start talking about some of these crosses that he did. But to review, when we're talking about genetics, we first defined genetics, then talked about genes and chromosomes and some key things to keep in mind. Then after bullet point number 1, we moved on to 2, talking about the contributions of Mendel, who Mendel was, the 3 laws that he came up with. We talked about the garden peas that he used, how sexual reproduction occurs in flowers and the things you need to remember about it. Then a little bit about the experiments that he did and how cross-pollination was important. And then lastly, we finished up by talking about overall his experiments and went through a couple of key terms that you should know when we are talking about genetics and Mendel. That's all I have for you. Bye-bye.